Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Touchstone webinar presented by GIFT.ed in partnership, of course, with the Club of Rome. My name is Rohan Hazel. I'm the Managing Director of GIFT.ed, and I have the pleasure of opening today's conversation. So I know we have people from all across the world joining, so good morning, good afternoon, and of course, good evening to wherever you might be. I'm in Malaysia with Chandran, our interviewer for today, and it's 11 p.m. for us. So for those of you joining from the same time zone, we appreciate the commitment. For those unfamiliar with us, GIFT.ed is a global knowledge platform born from the Global Institute for Tomorrow, or GIFT, and it's a think tank dedicated to equipping professionals and youth with the insights and tools to navigate and redesign our complex, rapidly changing world. So today marks our second webinar in partnership with the Club of Rome, a network of some of the world's most influential thinkers, and it's best known for its pioneering work on the limits to growth and long-term perspectives on civilization. And the limits to growth is actually going to be a topic that we discuss today with our expert. So across this webinar series, we're exploring regenerative organizations and economies, not just as a sustainability imperative, but also as a novel and necessary way to lead and create value, as well as reimagine our well-being. So I'm delighted to introduce today's interviewer, and it's Chandran Nair. So Chandran is the founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, as well as the chairman of GIFT.ed. He's the former APAC chairman at ERM and a global thought leader known for challenging common narratives and paradigms and introducing and reframing some post-Western ideas in a world that sorely needs an Asian lens at the moment. So our guest for today is Gaya Harrington, a name many of you will recognize. Gaya is, of course, the Vice President of Sustainability Research at Schneider Electric and a member of the Club of Rome. Perhaps most notably, she is the author of the landmark 2020 study that revisited the limits to growth and reignited global attention on the model's warnings and validating its relevance for today. And I know that she's going to talk about that in her opening as well. So her work's been featured everywhere, from the Financial Times, The Guardian, and she continues to be a leading voice in advocating for a shift towards well-being-oriented economic models. So Gaya's expertise spans econometrics, corporate sustainability, and systems thinking, all anchored in a clear and bold values-driven action in the face of existential risk. So it's a real pleasure to have both of you with us today. To everyone tuning in, thank you for being here. And if you have questions during the webinar, please just drop them in the Q&A tab. We'll do our best to get to them after our experts have had their conversation. So that's all from me. Chandran, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohan. Thank you for the introduction. And to everyone from all corners of the world, welcome. As Rohan said, we're both in Kuala Lumpur today. It's pretty hot, been a pretty hot day, actually. We haven't had much rain for about a week, and it's 11 p.m. So we're pretty dedicated a lot here. Gaya, welcome. I think you're today in Seattle, and it's great that we're all connected in this way. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you. I've heard a lot about you. Of course, we're both members of the Club of Rome, but with COVID and other things, we haven't had the opportunity to meet. But I'm hoping that perhaps the end of this year at the annual meeting or something, we will get a chance to meet in person. But thank you so much. So the format today is for Gaya to take about 10 minutes or so to outline the work she has done, and particularly in the context of the framework of today's discussion, which is resetting the engine of growth, how business can thrive within limits. So, Guy, I'm going to keep this brief, invite you to address the audience, and then we can have a conversation. And then to the audience, please, send us all your questions. And then we will try and get Gaya to also answer those questions. And it'll also help me to have the conversation with Gaya as soon as she finishes her it takes her 10 or 12 minutes or whatever she takes to put her case forward. Gaya, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Chandran. It is 8 a.m. here, so it's really it's really nice to see us spanning the globe here. So thank you so much for being here, whatever time zone you're in. I'm gonna share my screen now, and then we'll get right into it. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion as well. So let's start. with the beginning, I think somebody, the limits to growth study was mentioned, and that's what my work is based on. And maybe it's good to just have a quick recap of what that was, because this was in the 1970s, and a group of thinkers in Rome came together and discussed what they called the predicament of humankind. Why is it that despite all our progress and innovation, we keep having these persistent problems of poverty, pollution, conflict, resource scarcity? Presumably, these things are interrelated, they said, but how? And they asked a group of MIT scientists to find them that answer. Now, this club that met in Rome is now called the Club of Rome. They have more members than back then, but this group that you see in the middle, these MIT researchers, um, did find an answer. They published it in what was a bestseller at the time, The Limits to Growth, which was commissioned by the Club of Rome. And what they found was that if we were to continue the business as usual, that we would see a collapse setting in around now, today, present day. And collapse doesn't mean the end of humankind, but it does mean a steep decline from a previous peak in welfare, also population, etc. So what was behind this? When I looked at it, because I was thinking just a few years back, we have a few decades worth of empirical data. So can we see how accurate their analysis was? And I found that not many people had done that. So I did that in 2020. And then the research went viral. And you see a couple of the headlines here on the right. Editors love the word collapse because it's very, it gets clicks, basically. But my findings really were a bit more nuanced. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And if you're interested, I also have I've written a book. You can purchase the copy, but I also made it available for free in a PDF online. So the limits to growth, there have been many books written about it, so there's too much to go into, but it was a first of its kind world model at the time. System dynamics was the technique they used at the time that was new, and this was for the world where all variables can interact. So we have industrial output, population, food, also well-being, which is not in here, but there were many variables that were interacting. And they created different scenarios with that. The business as usual scenario ran on only historical averages, but there were also other scenarios. And one of them was what they called at the time stabilized world. Today we would probably call it sustainable world, and that's on the bottom right. And there were no declines in that one. However, that scenario definitely had some additional assumptions on top of historical averages. So what society does there is that it redirects resources away from industrial output and then toward human services like education and health and natural preservation. And what you see then is that there are no declines in that one. So you see that, for example, here in the human welfare variable. That's one of the variables I used in my analysis. The stabilized world is the orange yellow one, and it's mostly steady. Again, you see that collapse pattern better in the others, including business as usual. I did it for many variables. I think arguably we were the most interested in human well-being, so that's the one I chose. And it gives a good impression of the overall findings. So the purple dashed line is empirical data. So what I found was an overall close alignment with the scenarios, which is, first of all, pretty impressive because I saw many models. I've seen many models in my life. I studied econometrics. I started my career at a bank, so in the financial sector. I don't know any other model that was this accurate decades into the future. So if we think it's a good model or a useful model, as they say, then we should heed its message. And what is this message? Well, it's still a close alignment because we're at the peak. So the trajectories are not that different yet, but they're starting to diverge right now. And it was possible to distinguish between them already. And what I found based on the empirical data comparison is that we're at least closely aligned with stabilized world and most closely aligned with business as usual too. And that's the version that runs on historical averages and takes the upper estimate of how many fossil fuels we have left in the Earth's crust. And what you see is that more resources compared to the business as usual one, say the blue one, it doesn't avoid a collapse. If anything, it makes it steeper because you can continue business as usual for longer because you don't run out of fossil fuels as early. And in my opinion, that's exactly what we're seeing right now. The cause of collapse in business as usual too is pollution. And so I think this is the approximate for the climate change scenario. So what does this mean? To me, this means that we're not on a trajectory for a sustainable path. I'm assuming this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody on this call. But we do still have, we're not that far away yet from stabilized worlds to not realign ourselves, but it has to be a conscious, a deliberate choice. And we're fastly running out of time to make that change in course direction. And so what do we do to align ourselves deliberately with stabilized worlds? Well, remember the assumption. We redirect resources away from industrial output growth towards human services and natural protection. What does that mean? That's where we redefine our economic system away from continuous growth in stuff towards meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. And so that aligns with what we see today in this well-being economy paradigm or post-growth, or there are several names for it. And so that's where we are today. We don't need the limits to growth to know that we're at a now or never moment in history. Other scientists have warned of this with way more precision. We have the planetary boundaries. We have Earth overshoot. We know that we're at an all-time high when it comes to use of fossil fuels, despite enormous innovation. Just like the Club of Rome said, we have enormous innovation in renewable energy, but it has wholly been added on top of the fossil fuel use. We are at an all-time high for fossil fuel use, not just our carbon footprint, but the fossil fuel use in absolute amounts. The coal use even is at an all-time high today. So all that renewable energy capacity that we created has gotten on top of it on a global level. And so that's what happens, of course, in a system where the ultimate goal is growth. It's an addition. So how do we change that? Some people sometimes wonder. It's not a matter of we don't know how. We have the policies. We certainly have the technologies, right? But we also know what kind of policies safeguard livelihoods in the absence of economic growth. And we have the economic models around that. So we have post-growth economics or donuts. Several people will probably be familiar with that one. Full circle economics, which is less known, but it focuses on, hey, we are not going to have that material circularity if you don't also circulate finance, money and power, basically. Regenerative economics. This builds on ecological economics, which was also thought up in the 70s, so that goes back a little bit further. We have degrowth, of course, which is not that destination framework. It's more of a pathway from this current growthist economy to those new economies where we want to arrive at. So we all have that. What do businesses in that? It's a good question, right? Businesses can still be profitable. I think this is an often misunderstood point. And it just goes to show how growthist we've become. Because I say, well, maybe we shouldn't make growth the ultimate goal. And then what people hear is, oh, she's anti-growth. She wants us to go into a permanent recession. It's not the same thing. Businesses can still be profitable, but it's a difference between profit making and profit maximization. And if necessary at all other costs. That's the key difference. If you are a business, you have a societal purpose, and to get to that purpose, you make profit, but not the other way around. And of course, the difference would also be that you don't go from the greener products. Chandran, I know that you mentioned this in your book, The Sustainable State, as well, very much like there's a difference between the eco or the green option, which is basically less bad, and sustainability, which really is an absolute measure. You can either continue to do this or you cannot. And of course, what we're doing right now is not sustainable. And so we have that imperative, right? What we're doing cannot last. We have the urgency because we're at tipping points in the climate in the global ecosystem, really. And we also have the means. We have the possibility. We know what we have to do. It's a lot of effort. It's not easy, but we do know it's possible. And then what's often missed there is the opportunity. And that's why I always would like to end with that because really we don't need this is not I'm not proposing a capitulation to grim necessity to avoid collapse. We have to do this. We would want to do this anyway because the current economy actually does a poor job in meeting all our human needs. It does an adequate job providing us with stuff. So at our basic needs, it does adequately to for some and some not so much. And then but what it once our basic needs are met, and this is very interesting, and this is where also our current economic paradigm has failed us. The neoclassical economics that tells us that we are the Homo economicus, we're selfish maximizers, and we discount our impacts on others as externalities. And it actually doesn't describe us very well. We can be very selfish and violent if our basic needs are not met. But once they are, it's almost like we kind of flip and we become so playful and curious and altruistic. And we are driven by this indomitable urge to leave the world a little bit better than we found it. And that this economic system doesn't see that. So, in other words, our social and spiritual needs are very poorly met. Even the winners in the current economic system, the people in the West who clearly have much more stuff than they would ever need. The majority is very clear from surveys are disconnected at work. They feel like their jobs are just tricks for money. So, in a well-being economy, government and citizens and businesses all are working to meet human needs directly within planetary boundaries, not through profit, fingers crossed, but directly. And that would leave us all, everybody, it is clear why that would be better for the current people at the bottom half of the population. But it also would leave people in more affluent situations with way more meaning, way more sense of community. In other words, the connection that is very clearly what we're craving these days. If decoupling is not happening, we see that in terms of the carbon footprint. But what has decoupled in richer countries is happiness from growth. The US, where I live, is a very good example of that. And so that's how I would like to end. I say this a lot. I say it in my TED talk as well. If you want to see that, it was recorded about a year ago about the well-being economy. And I often say that we would have less stuff in a well-being economy, but we would have more of what we need, connection. And that's really what this well-being economy offers. It's material sufficiency, but social abundance and spiritual wealth. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. A lot of stuff there. I am tempted to engage you in a sort of like almost a private discussion and then be a sort of panelist with you, but I'm reminded that I'm just here to guide the conversation, and there's so much here that you've mentioned that is worth exploring. I hope we get the time together with the Q&A. You know, I like your reference to the profit issue, and in the last few months, I've been arguing that profit is not a right. And in fact, a lot of companies think they have a right to a profit, but it's actually not a right for all the reasons you mentioned about the externalities. So let me start with one question that, you know, I hope we can get this conversation going. And the first one is, you work for a corporation, and in the last couple of months, a large corporation, and in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge backlash against ESG. In fact, much of that backlash exposing the sort of narrow sort of narrative of the whole ESG kind of industry, if that's not being too unfair. And then we've also seen in the last 6-7 months a big sort of retreat of large corporations from much of the things that's said, and about what I call myths like net zero and all of those other things. We've seen a retreat. slightly, in many ways, emboldened by the current U.S. administration that sort of made people think, companies think, well, these things don't matter. So my first question to you is, why have so many companies so easily, taken that way out? And as soon as they got a green light from the new U.S. administration, and was it because, in a way, none of these companies, and particularly the leaders, ever believed in any of this because they always wanted growth in that very narrow definition and never really explored the sort of stuff you're talking about?
Exactly. That's what I did, the juxtaposition I made earlier, right? If as long as you stay, if you don't have that mindset shift, you do the sustainability because at the time it seemed like a good business case, right? It's good for your reputation and all those things. And so when those external motivators basically change, then you change your standpoint. Actually makes total sense within that frame. And so it really is right now what I would say is a mask off moment. You know which companies were always serious and which were just doing PR. That's really what you're seeing right now. And last year, Schneider Electric was voted most sustainable corporation in the world by Time Magazine, and at the time I still made a post. And this year I didn't make a post about it because I was like, it's not even because we got voted it again, but it's just because we didn't walk back our climate goals. That's all we had to do this year, just
Yeah.
doing the same thing, and while the others rolled back their goals, and it's very. I'll be honest with you, and I think a lot of sustainability researchers and advisors are struggling with this for a long time. We thought that when they made these goals, right, it was just a couple of years ago, we thought, okay, we can influence some of these multinationals to become a force for good. And you do see that some sustainability professionals have changed their entire strategy because it's now clear that the multinationals, they don't, most of them just don't seem to have set up well enough to make that change and be part of the solution. Which is, I'm saddened to say that, but it's unfortunately what we're witnessing.
Okay, good, Gaia. So I'll just take you up on a couple of points there when you said you need a greater consciousness. But surely, CEOs and board members, if there's one thing they're not hired for, it's having a consciousness. So what are we saying here? That essentially, given the nature of the existential threats, we all know the potential collapse in different parts of the world. Are we actually saying that large organizations have to be highly regulated in an era of constraints, potential catastrophic collapse? And that brings in the question of the role of the government and the state. And I'm asking that question because, it's a topic that I talk about a lot, but I'm wondering where you see this, given that you just said that you can't, unless they have consciousness. But, large companies don't hire people and successful CEOs because they're conscious individuals. In fact, if anything, you could argue, not being harsh, that it's the lack of consciousness that took some of the people to the top of the sort of the business as usual model.
I agree, and I think that and that's why we need systems change, right? I would say not the right people always get promoted, and sometimes I think more accurate would be to say we as human beings have both those traits. We can be selfish and very altruistic, and you want to have a system that's set up to stimulate the behavior that is desirable, so the more altruistic one. And I think what we currently are having is the exact opposite. And that's why it will never work within this current system. I think everybody in a sustainability world has been on this journey, where they started out, even, Jason Hickel, the degrowth advocate, even he says, I used to believe in green growth. We all came there, and at some point you realize, oh, it's not going to work within this current system. And that's a journey. So I think it is important to know that most people, so also most people working at corporations, want to do good. They're just very restricted and limited in that. And I think that's one of the key topics you see emerge right now is ownership. Who owns these companies and who makes the decisions? And what you see is that when you have, for example, employee ownership or cooperative, so the people who are using the company, stewarding it and or using its products, if they are also the owners, you get very different outcomes and outcomes that are much more aligned with what we are, with what we would want to see, what the local community and overall society needs. So that's one of those things. So if you talk about the government, I think what we need is all parties to work. So we have the business sector, the government, and also very importantly the citizenship. Citizens are the commons capital owners basically are a force of themselves. They've been marginalized over the decades, and I think that's another force that needs to be reinstated, rehabilitated. You do need government for that. You need conducive regulations for that. Yes, businesses should absolutely be more regulated. I think that's very clear. But it's not just government. And I think democracy in that sense, it isn't just voting for your representatives. It's also having your own comments and stewarding that yourself, because the people who live there typically know best what to do for the community. So that's a thing I would add to what you're saying. That sometimes I feel we're forced between these two different things. Oh, it's either the private sector or it's the public sector, and it's also a third power, which is us all together,
Sure.
working and collaboratively creating our local economy.
No, thank you. So, you mentioned democracy, and I don't want to get into that because it's a hot topic, but it is germane part a bit because maybe it's not democracy. So I'll just leave it out there. Maybe it's not democracy as defined within the Western lens of what operating systems should govern societies and how do large countries operate within this. So I'll pick up on one of your findings of your study, and particularly the quote about that the economic goal should change. I think that's what you were saying. The economic goal should change from growth to human and ecological well-being. I mean, the cynics will say, that's all well and good. I've all heard this. And I will say, I've heard that a lot of times, but I'm not a cynic. I think I know what you're saying. But really, this definition of growth as well, and what is growth, etc., comes from the sort of intellectual discussion taking place in more advanced countries. And you talked about basic needs, and I don't need to go into all the amount of the data, but most of the world does not essentially, most people in the majority world do not even have most of their basic needs met. And you can give examples of a country like India, perhaps, and then one like Nigeria or somewhere else. So in that sort of situation where that is probably the majority of the world, you need development. We could argue that there's no development without some sort of growth. And we're not talking about the growth of a multinational company, but you're talking about the growth of the economy that you're producing various goods and services to meet the needs. How do you address this dilemma? Because, you and I can discuss this, and I can see government officials in other countries saying, oh, this is a nice esoteric discussion from a Western narrative. But for the global majority, we still need growth or development. So the question I'm trying to ask you is, how do you see what is the purpose of the economy going forward, right? And looking at both an advanced economy like the United States, where, as you said, most people have, and there are lots of poor people, but once that is met, what is the role of the state in shaping the economy, and what is the role of the state in shaping the economy in countries where the basic needs are still to be met, and what does growth and development mean in that context?
Yep. Yeah, as I said before, I'm not anti-growth. So if in any kind of economy, if the well-being can be improved through growth, then we should do that. Sorry. Sorry, I got a pop-up. If I agree, I think the pathway or the so-called degrowth pathway from this growthist economy to a well-being one I think the pathway will look very different depending on whether you're a high income country or a low income country. I think in lower income countries, you can still talk about what the World Bank calls green growth policies, right? Because I agree there, if material basic needs are not met, you should and they can be met and growth comes along with that, then let's do it. All I'm saying is we should be more selective about it. So if it doesn't, which is also possible in many situations where growth doesn't actually contribute to well-being, it just accumulates further at the top, then we should not do it. And that's what you will see more often in high income countries where we are already far above our fair share of Earth's carrying capacity. So the challenge there is not to grow further, but really see if we can maintain the current levels of material well-being while bringing down our ecological footprint, which does seem possible if you share radically more equally.
All right.
And
So
I think
go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's really goes to the heart of this. Ultimately,
Okay.
also,
All
this
right.
is inextricably linked to inequalities within countries and between countries, right?
Between
We have to
countries.
reduce
Right.
reduce
Right.
the inequality, well, both within and between countries. Yeah.
Right. So if you then look at the what we call the developing world, which would constitute mainly, Europe and North America, and then a few other countries. But if you looked at Europe and North America, what are we seeing? We're seeing nations essentially, who are afraid of basically becoming partners in a new post colonial world where they had access to all the resources, the growth, etc. So they want to maintain that economic hegemony, if I can use that word. So if you take the United States, the current administration wants to put tariffs, etc., because they want themselves to grow more, and you're in the United States. So what do you do to change that? Because you say we have to change. Who is going to change that? Would you agree with me that what we're talking about is changing the political economy? And I'm going to go back to the United States. What hope in hell is there of that happening in the next 30 years?
So I hear this a lot. So I don't think we can ever, in short, I don't think we can convince the Trump administration to go post growth. Here's the
No,
thing, though.
but the Trump administration is only going to be around for another 4 years. So, after that, what's happening?
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
uh, but the thing is, I listen. Growth will halt one way or another.
Yes,
This
that'd
this
be
was also
catastrophic. Yeah, that'd be catastrophic. Yeah.
this was my quote, I think, where how this webinar was advertised. Because I say this a lot, because I get this question a lot, and I'm like, it seems you're operating on the assumption that, well, we can do business as usual, or we can change our economy. And it's like, no, that's not the choice. Business as usual is absolutely non-viable. It will stop way or another. Our choice is how we stop it. If it's design or disaster. The well-being economy is the design. The disaster seems to be where we're heading right now. So one way or another, the system will change.
Yeah, so I'm in agreement with you. I was not making that assumption at all, but you have to think about the world's largest economy today, which is also resource hungry, seeks to maintain its control on global resources everywhere. That's why it wants all of these trade deals. So I am saying that I agree with you. Business as usual has to change. But the political system is very much hinged toward the neoliberal idea that it is business as usual will not change. The largest companies, largest corporations are willing to go with it. And to your point, well, if you do, business as usual will end in some sort of catastrophe and collapse. But that is not the outcome we want. We want to prevent that collapse. So the question is, how does that happen when we see in the most advanced economies a great reluctance to do anything that shifts? And on the other side of the world, you have all these large countries, a lot of people have their basic needs not fulfilled, resource scarcity, etc., trying to scramble out of that thing, but creating growth, but to meet basic needs, homes, sanitation, all of those things. And that, I think, is the question that most people want to know, because ultimately you need a political system that can enforce, and this is the point I was trying to come to, and where would it, or how would that manifest itself, if not in the United States, in Europe?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I wasn't saying you were operating under that. I meant you as in the general you. I know you you are very well aware. Uh, I think, to be perfectly honest with you, and I take no pleasure in saying this, but I do think, especially since the election of Donald Trump, I think we are looking at the system not being able, by and large, to be changed from within. And I think it will break. And to some extent, and again, I don't say this with any pleasure,
Yeah, yeah, none of us
but
want to see that. Yeah.
yeah, but I think the current Trump administration is gonna break the current system faster. And really,
Mhm.
what the job that I see for myself is not necessarily preventing collapse anymore. I was more optimistic when I read my book, but since I wrote my book just 4 years ago, we've gone in the opposite direction, if anything. And so I think right now what I'm doing is trying to make the collapse as just as possible and sowing seeds for how we rebuild. Once that has happened, again, this is not the end of humankind at all. There will be a lot of natural destruction
Yeah.
and human suffering. And it will have, and I think the hardest thing about that will be that it was unnecessary. It didn't have to be like this. We could have designed our economy better and differently, and we didn't. Um, I think at this point, I'm just sowing the seeds for once that becomes undeniably clear for everyone, how are we going to rebuild? And that's these kind of principles.
Okay, very good. I want to kind of shift gears a bit, because I think we could have a long conversation along that thread about what happens next, what sort of systems, because people in democracies, people elect these people. I mean, Donald Trump got elected by a majority, so it tells you something else about how the societies work. And then you're seeing in Europe as well, that fear of a new world in which others are arriving, and a lot more people than when the Club of Rome's report was written 52 years ago, when the world's population was 3 billion. So the question that I thought, people would be interested in understanding from your point of view was your point of view when you did this. One of the things I'm interested in, and I hope you can shed some light on this, is many of the things that we use technology for, and I'm not just talking about digital technology, is to essentially increase productivity, whether it was a chainsaw 100 years ago or whatever
Mm.
it was. I always say in my country, it might have taken 5 men 2 weeks to cut a large rainforest tree and take it to the nearest town. Today, you could do it probably in 2 hours with a helicopter and take it out. So technology essentially is allowing us to use resources and therefore measure this productivity. Did you look at the issue of 1971, 2000, and where we are now? How is technology actually completely speeding up, right? And our obsession with productivity, creating essentially forces that are depleting resources at such a pace that all the other measures that we're trying to take seem to ignore the issue of the role of technology and how we essentially reward even technology. And that includes now digital technology.
Yeah. Um, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear loud and
Oh,
clear.
sorry. This is this is an excellent example of how technology works, is a tool and works for the overall goal of the system it's part of.
Yes.
So it's done great to speed up growth.
Yes.
I don't know why people are. You see this a lot. We are very innovative, and this is also the answer to the Club of Rome's question when they first started, right? Why, despite all this progress and innovation, do we keep seeing these problems? Because these tools, the innovation, ultimately goes towards growth, and if along the way it also solves some societal problems, that's great. But if it can't contribute to growth, then we're also not going to do it. And that's the key difference, the key mindset shift, where we would imagine what the world would look like if all these technologies would be shared also with people who don't have money to afford them, and how that would change things. How if AI wasn't used to optimize to increase advertisement, but really to connect people, to improve our democracies, for radical circularity of materials, it would be a completely different world. So the technology is not the issue, but of course it's what it's put towards to do, that's the issue.
Of course, technology, you could argue, as many have argued, is neutral, agnostic, but technology is owned by the same business as usual sort of growth,
Exactly.
profiteering entities, and that concentration is where we find ourselves. So now we have about 15 minutes more. There's some questions because I've got a ton to say, but I've already said too much. So let me just put some of these questions to you and see, what your responses are. So the question we have here from someone is, we have more wars now than any time in recent history. Can we really talk about degrowth without addressing warmongering as well? And as you know, there was a recent report last week by the UN special, I forget her exact title, but overseeing the Gaza conflict, and talked about the amount of companies that were profiteering from what's now, I think, generally acknowledged as a genocide. So I think this question is quite relevant, but I don't expect you to get into the details. But I wondered if you would care to talk about it. This does fall into the category of what I said as well about in many other parts of the world, even with our wars, where there's so much deprivation, bad governance, etc. They need growth, they need development. So how do you factor in this issue now that we have so many wars? And how do we talk about degrowth without addressing the question of what are the root causes of these conflicts?
Yeah, it is an excellent question. We don't have time to go into it too
Yeah.
much,
Keep
but
it, yeah.
ultimately, if we're talking about narratives, the Rihanna Eisler has done some really interesting historic work on what ultimately are the different kind of narratives that underlie how people organize a society. And you have partnership on one end of the spectrum and domination on the other. And partnership is egalitarian. There's a lot of sharing, and it is sustainable. Domination always has places is very hierarchical, so men above men, men above women, certain religions above other religions, etc. They're also very violent. They're also inherently unsustainable, and because they don't care for their for human well-being really enough and in an environment. So they have a strong drive to growth. There's always, and in all their in earlier history, it was growth in land, etc. And now that growth has gone to the economy and still land, of course. So that's what underlying this domination more mindsets are always will always be keep fighting because they have to, because if they don't keep grow, they implode. So that's ultimately what's driving this. If you look at the practical implications of that, it's an under-researched part of degrowth, but I think it's an excellent point. If you look at Ukraine, Ukraine has asked the Club of Rome to give them advice on how to structure their economy after they win the war. But it's an excellent example. They have to have good defenses, right? This is an important part because sometimes people argue, well, if we didn't spend as much to the army, and I think in the US you can make that argument because it's a hell of a suck for all kinds of resources, and we're not. Canada is not going to attack us, but Mexico not either. But I think it really depends on the country, and I think in general, countries like Finland or Ukraine, they do have to maintain their armies, etc. Yeah.
Okay, so that's I mean that's a complex topic as we said. I mean, who's going to help Gaza? Club of Rome, maybe. Let's see. But to the other point, here's a question: what does collapse actually look like? I mean, and I often say there are many parts of the world where I've been to where collapse is happening. And so again, it's contextual, but can you give a couple of examples from different parts of the world based on your experience or your modeling? What does collapse look like? Will it be over generations, but we all think it's speeding up, and we don't recognize the collapse? The collapse also manifests in the way political systems are essentially evolving. Or is it simply a different for wealthier societies? It's actually just a reduction in convenience, and I call indulgence. The ability to indulge is seen as a human right and indulge in overconsumption. But as for others, a collapse would mean from not having access to safe water uh, regularly to actually not having access at all. So could you share your views in any of the work you've done that gives some sense of what is collapse? Because people conjure the world burning.
I think it's an excellent question. You're absolutely right. And that's why I always, when I say collapse, I immediately follow it. It doesn't mean the end of civilization because it's
Yes,
not
that's right.
ashes from fallen from the sky and we're all walking around like
That's right.
zombies. That's exactly right. It collapse is simply technically a steep decline from a previous peak.
That's right.
And so how that will play out, it will play out differently over time across the globe. I do think we are already in collapse. If you look at the US, I think it's very clearly
Yes.
these political movements also illustrate that. And if you're asking about what, well, have I done some work? Well, we have done some work in the Earth for All Commission, which is part of the Club of Rome, which made a new model of the world to analyze that. And one of the original Limits to Growth authors, Jürgen Renders, was part of that as well. And he said, well, really what you'll see is that the societal collapse will come before the environmental one. And I think that's what you're seeing, the disconnection. I think the US is a prime example of that. So because inequality is relatively high in the US, you see it setting in faster. And I think also how it will play out might be very different from more egalitarian countries. Because how it will play out will also depend on these kind of factors. So if you have less inequality, I think you may be able to take the route that you described, Chandran, of okay, we're all just slowly realizing that we just all have to do it last man, and you do it like that. I think in other parts of the world, because of the high inequality, you will get proper class warfare, for example. I
Yeah.
think that's what we're going to be witnessing in
Yeah.
parts of the world.
So I mean, it is a complex topic. I'm glad we're at least touching on it because if you look at some of the countries in the crowded part of the world, and I'm treading carefully, but I think I can say if you look at parts of India, where some of the modeling on climate change suggests that in some states, daytime temperatures in summer could be over 50 degrees, then you've got a very different type of, you're not, in the US, it's
Right.
manifesting in the jobs going, etc., and then the political sort of chaos that is ensuing. In those parts of the world, in that part of the world, it is very different. It's essentially a collapse of the resource, of the ecological system, led by climate change. So I think these are very different things. And then the question is, who protects us people? And then, I have my own theories about the role of the state and how it needs to be organized and its competence, and the whole issue of rights and freedoms, etc. Here's a question then which someone's asked. How can the thinking regarding resetting the engine of growth be applied in an organization context? I think this is a good one because many organizations are struggling. Many sustainability professionals like you, I know many of them, and I
Are
used to
frustrated. Yeah.
but I think partly it's their own fault, but that's a different topic because I don't think many people asserted themselves. I've always said I thought sustainability experts thought they were ahead of the game, but never understood fully that the game was changing so swiftly that they had to take control in organizations. So I never met on sustainability or a person in a company at any power. But having said that, how does that really look like now in an organization when we start thinking about resetting the engine of growth? Do companies even have the intellectual capabilities to examine these issues? Because it's not a sustainability only discussion. It's not something that someone who's gone and done an ESG course for 3 months and then become head of sustainability then can discuss, because it's a much more complex issue, as you know.
Right.
You're going to need anthropologists, social scientists, economists, etc. Are companies geared to handle such intellectually complex issues to actually think about this and come up with solutions to reframe their entire purpose, their business models, etc.?
I mean, the business sector is very diverse. So it's hard to answer that because there are some awful companies. And there are also, you saw this in COVID, for example, some just had mass layoffs and some were like, you know what, we used to make this, but now we're just making masks, y'all. So there's not a business sector. It does depend on the business. In general, though, I would say I think this is clearly no, but they will have to change one way or another. And I do think they could change rather quickly. Businesses can do that. And it is totally possible. I think it's very important. I do hear this a lot where they say, listen, you can't expect companies to like not prioritize profits above anything else. And I'm like, oh no, then why are we already pretending we're doing that? Because if you look, and every company has this vision and mission thing on their website, and their employees typically can't tell you because they know it's nonsense, but it's
Yes,
there, and it's going on about how they contribute to society. So that's, I think, a dead giveaway that actually we all kind of feel that that is what businesses should do. That's where, in English at least, I know nothing of Chinese or Indian law, but in America, at the very early corporate law, you actually had to have a purpose. That's where the word license to operate comes from. You had to have, if you couldn't be there just for profit. Obviously, that is now completely changed, and we have the fiduciary duty to shareholders, but it didn't start out that way. So this model that we're having now, the sociopathic structure of a company, is actually very recent, and it's very telling that it's already run out. We had it for several decades. It didn't even last a century. That's how unsustainable it is. So if you look at how humankind typically organized itself, because we've been doing that for centuries, markets, jobs, etc., trade, we had that for centuries. It was always much more around just sharing the goods that we had together. And it was never about growth. For most of human history, the pursuit of growth was considered foolish, if not downright immoral. So I understand how, for some people, it's hard to grasp that because we have all grown up in it. Everybody on this call has been alive. As long as we've been alive, the growth imperative was there. But it's important to realize that really in the bigger perspective of human history, it's an absolute blip.
absolutely. And as you know much better than me, the population of the world was only about a billion people 200 years ago. And then with the exponential curve in terms of 1 billion to 200 years ago, 2 billion 100 years ago, and now we're about 8 billion. And therefore, people shared and societies were different because there was a lot more to go around, but there was less technology that enabled the resource extraction rates and things like that. And so today we live in a very unique time where all of those are converging, but we're still using a business model that is archaic, imagining the world is empty and we can do everything and have everything we want. We got 5 minutes, Mo, and here's a couple of questions, quick answers, and then, let's see if we get a third one in very quickly. So what is one piece of advice you would give to those tuning in who want to act but don't know how, or feel overwhelmed and unable to act?
Yeah, that's an excellent
It's a
question.
hard one, yeah.
No, but I get that a lot, and
Yeah,
that is the challenging thing of systems, and I think that's why some people flee and go
yes.
into like flee in denial of techno optimism and that sort of stuff. Elon Musk is going to save us with his EVs, because it's overwhelming. I get that. So I actually talk about that in my book. If you want to read it again, it's free for download because it's very
Please,
personal.
everyone, download and read it.
It's systems change is overwhelming, and at the same time it's a deeply personal process. So that's where you have all these problems. If anybody is familiar with Otto Scharmer, is also a Club of Rome member,
Mhm.
you recognize his theory you see all these big problems, so you start here at the top, and then you go down and you realize it's all underlying it is this narrative that in our structure. And right now, that narrative is what I call the story of separation. We are all selfish maximizers, and our kindness is just a tactic to propagate genes and beat the competition. That's it. And then you start by deconstructing that narrative, healing from it, and you see if this new, of different or really old narrative, because indigenous populations have never forgotten it, the story of interdependence in which we are nature. And once our basic needs are met, we rejoice in contributing to this web of life that we feel in our hearts is we're all part of, and we want to contribute to it. So once you get from that narrative, you can't stay there, but it does start there. If you don't change the narrative, you will ultimately just do the ESG stuff. You won't change the system. You will just try to fix it and you will fail. But you also then have to go back into the system once you change that narrative. You can't stay there. That's the hippie accusation. No, you're enlightened and now you're just doing yoga all day. So you go back into the system. That's very uncomfortable because you're now working in a system, the narrative of which you don't really share. And so how you do that is connect, not with most people. Systems change it doesn't take the majority for it. You need about 25%, and then the change will become self-reinforcing. And how you do that is find others that share your narrative, and you don't need many. 3, 4, with 5 you can move mountains. And then you build out, see how together you can build out this new narrative into the system structures. That's going to be uncomfortable, and be patient with yourself and try to get comfortable with that uncomfortability, the tension for now. And that's how we make systems change happening.
Great, Gaya. One more. So last question is essentially, I'm glad you mentioned changing the narratives. Rohan talked about GIFT.ed, and so it's not an advert, but we are primarily about changing the entire narrative around what it is. And therefore, even down to this issue, which I playfully mentioned, that ideal governance systems in a full world with constraints, etc., is not necessarily one defined as democracy, and there are different political systems. So I'll give you the last word on this. What sort of political system, therefore, I know this is a slightly unfair one, but what sort of political system would essentially in 20 years be the system in the United States for the well-being economy that you say it has to have, or otherwise will collapse? Because I think there are other models, and one model we haven't mentioned, but which many people look at now as an example, is the Chinese model, which is a very different way where the collective welfare takes precedence over individual rights. And whereas in the Western economic model, the individual is king. So over to you for the last kind of bit about what the political economy needs to look like, because it has to essentially be at the center, I assume, also of the well-being economy. It can't just be people going around doing their own thing.
No, I agree. So I agree with you on it needs to be more for the common people and the commons. I personally see more, and this is also dangerous to say,
Say it, yes.
elements of Marxism, and absolutely nothing of the Soviet-style communism.
Mm.
But I do think that really what has happened now is that a lot of our commons have basically been taken away from us. The air pollution, right? The clean air, clean water, land. It's just taken, and then the profits are privatized, but the costs are obviously socialized. We all know this conundrum. And I think a lot of it has to do with giving the commoners has a negative connotation, but the
Yeah.
common people back their common capitals, which includes water and air, but also our data, for example, that we generate. That's all ours. We have to take that back, and I see a lot more of a role for common citizenry to govern that. If you look at, I agree with you that, for example, the current democracy, you said in your book, it's not enough for democracy to have elections. And I think that's my favorite sentence of in the entire book, because you see that in the US. Like, it's not really a democracy. My answer would be more democracy. So what you see is if you do citizen assemblies, like you saw in France, they came up with much more radical climate policies than any politicians could. And I see a lot more in that sense for the citizen assemblies and just more pushing down governance structures, which technology, for example, could really enable. So radically more democracy, I think, in the future.
Great. So that leaves me to, close, but share one thing that I have tried to also argue. What is democracy? And I've argued, at least looking at China and India, that China is more democratic than India. So I leave everyone with that provocative sort of thought in terms of managing the complex set of issues that you've talked about so eloquently and written about so much as well. So, Gaya, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to hand over to Rohan to, say, close this, but write the next book. And please let us have some new ideas, and we would love to have you back as well. Rohan, over to you.
Yeah.
Thank you once more. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you, Chandran. It was an absolute pleasure. I am still intrigued by the background, but we didn't have time for that. But the background is absolutely lovely.
Thank you. Painting from China. Rohan, over to you.
I wish we had some time to talk about the painting, actually. Chandran's paintings are pretty legendary, actually. We try to have a different one in every background. But Gaya, thank you so much, Chandran, as well. Thank you. Gaya, your answers were so cogent. And in fact, we've had some comments in the chat thanking you for breaking down these complex ideas and topics. A personal reflection of mine is that some of the science and the arguments of this space can be fairly inaccessible to people. So I really think that you and your work are helping to turn this around. So thank you. And there's one final thank you I've got to give, and that's to everyone who attended and also who contributed questions. I saw some really interesting questions in the chat, and I wish that we had the time to go through them. I was parsing through them with my colleagues. Really, really interesting questions, and maybe we can convince Guy to come back and have another session with all of them. But thank you. Hope you all took something away from it, and we're really looking forward to the next webinar as well. As we close, one of my colleagues will share a screen and put up a QR code as well as some information about GIFT.ed and the Club of Rome, so you can find out more about our organizations. So thank you so much for attending, everyone. Gaya, Chandran, thank you again, and we'll hope to have you on soon. Bye-bye.